When invited by my colleagues in continuing education to give one of these presentations, I set myself to thinking about a topic in my field that would have appeal to a wide audience. My special expertise in canon law has to do with Catholic education at various levels, with parochial structures, especially in light of changing demographics and fewer ordained ministers, with priestly formation, with clerical discipline, with relations between religious and the hierarchy, and with ecumenism. Questions on those topics come my way from the two Vatican departments that I serve as a consultor, from bishops and conferences of bishops, from religious superiors. But the most frequent questions that come to me at the breakfast table, on airplanes, or in telephone calls from good friends or casual acquaintances are about marriage. Sometimes it's nullity or dissolution, but more often than not, it's preparation and celebration, especially when one party is not Catholic. In my 18 years of directly preparing people to serve in parish ministry, I have consistently reminded them that the ability to answer such questions constitutes baseline pastoral competence. If we cannot respond clearly and knowledgeably to fundamental questions of fact posed to us by people at important moments in their lives, how can we hope to have their confidence at other times? I regularly remind my students that they should not only know the Church's norms, but be able also to explain them, their value, and to apply them with pastoral sensitivity. This delicate role of the pastoral minister is especially critical when non-Catholic persons are involved. They, along with their Catholic intended spouses, are often confused by the Church's claim to competence in adjudicating the validity of previous marriages not in any way connected with the Catholic Church at the time of their celebration. This confusion is exacerbated when the non-Catholic party, burdened by a previous marriage, is seeking Catholic baptism or reception into full communion. I've chosen to explore the topic of mixed marriages because they have become increasingly more common in our contemporary ecclesial life in the United States and other confessionally pluralistic countries, Canada, Germany, the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Australia, as examples, where urbanization, migration, and other forms of demographic mobility have occasioned a greater frequency of mixed marriages in our era. Canon law is very dependent on texts and their interpretation. So the texts I've distributed to you can provide some quick references for you in the next hour, but they should also be of assistance later on. I've provided, for the sake of contrast, first a few norms from the 1917 Code of Canon Law, as well as the basic 1970 legislation of Pope Paul VI on mixed marriages, namely his motu proprio Matrimonia Mixta, whose 40th anniversary we will mark at the end of next month. This document provides something of the history and rationale for the post-conciliar discipline that it articulates and is subsequently codified in the Code of Canon Law. And so you have then the canons of the 1983 Code that are either directly or indirectly related to the topic. And finally, I've excerpted a key section of the 1993 Ecumenical Directory that addresses mixed marriages. While I could say much more, I thought it best to limit my presentation today to three basic questions on mixed marriages, and then to some comments on what is probably the most pressing issue that parties in mixed marriages face on their wedding day and for the lifetime that follows it, namely communicatio in sacris, or the sharing of the sacraments, and for ease I'll refer to that as CIS for the rest of the presentation. One last prenote on terminology. In this presentation, I shall use the term mixed marriage in its popular sense, generally to mean the marriage between a Catholic and a non-Catholic, whether baptized or not. And in fact, that's the term, that's the sense in which Paul VI uses the term in matrimonia mixta, even though that's not the definition in the Code. So let's proceed now to ask and answer 3 questions. First, may Catholics marry non-Catholics? Marriages between Catholics and unbaptized persons are invalid by reason of the ecclesiastical law impediment of disparity of worship. That's Canon 1086. This impediment may be dispensed from for a just and reasonable cause. Even with such a dispensation, these marriages are not sacramental and therefore not extrinsically indissoluble. Rather, the natural bond of marriage exists and a dissolution in favor of the faith is possible. We can talk about that a little bit more perhaps after the presentation if you have some questions about dissolution of marriage. The reason for the impediment is related to the sacramental character of Christian marriage. The grace that flows from the sacrament of marriage is a vital ingredient to its success, and Catholics are not to be lightly excused from contracting marriage that is sacramental and from taking the best advantage of the grace offered by God through the ministry of the Church. Marriages between Catholics and baptized non-Catholics are valid if no invalidating law has been broken, but they are prohibited unless expressly permitted. This is the provision of Canon 1124, which defines the mixed marriage. And it reads as follows: without express permission of the competent authority, a marriage is prohibited between 2 baptized persons of whom one is baptized in the Catholic Church or received into it after baptism, and the other of whom is enrolled in a church or ecclesial community not in full communion with the Catholic Church. So essentially, Orthodox churches and the different Protestants' ecclesial communions. You may note that I have omitted a phrase about defecting from the church by a formal act, which you'll find in your text of the Code. This unfortunate innovation of the 1983 Code was felicitously removed by Pope Benedict XVI in his motu proprio Omnium in Mentem of October 26, 2009. I'll spare you the details. The reason for the prohibition of mixed marriages may best be identified as the Church's preference that her sons and daughters marry others who are in full communion with her in order to preserve the integrity of their faith and foster family life and the education of their children harmoniously and with common regard for Catholic doctrine. The 1993 Ecumenical Directory at number 144 puts it this way: in all marriages, the primary concern of the Church is to uphold the strength and stability of the indissoluble marital union and the family life that flows from it. The perfect union of persons and full sharing of life, which constitutes the married state, are more easily assured when both partners belong to the same faith community. In addition, practical experience and the observations obtained in various dialogues between representatives of churches and ecclesial communities indicate that mixed marriages frequently present difficulties for the couples themselves and for the children born to them in maintaining their Christian faith and commitment and for the harmony of family life. For all these reasons, marriage between persons of the same ecclesial community remains the objective to be recommended and encouraged. Paul VI in Matrimonia Mixta largely dismisses the ecumenical value of mixed marriages when he says, the Church is indeed aware that mixed marriages, precisely because they admit differences of religion and are a consequence of the division among Christians, do not, except in some cases, help in establishing unity among Christians. Since, however, the jus nubendi, the right to marry, is a natural law right, reaffirmed in Matrimonia Mixta, this prohibition is not absolute and permission is granted once certain conditions are met. This is a very important principle in the canon law of marriage, namely that the jus nubendi, the right to marry, the right to choose your spouse and to raise a family with that spouse is a natural law gift of God, and that the church ought not unduly to inhibit that right. So even where the church imposes impediments that render marriage invalid, those impediments of ecclesiastical law can be dispensed because of the counterbalancing right to marriage that the church has always affirmed. Second question. Under what conditions can permission for a mixed marriage or a dispensation from the impediment of disparity of worship be given? So always try to distinguish those two issues, the permission for the mixed marriage, which is not necessary for the validity of the mixed marriage, or the dispensation from disparity of worship, without which an attempted marriage would be invalid, at least if one of the parties was Catholic. It's an impediment only of ecclesiastical law, therefore it binds only Catholics. A Protestant, for example, who marries a non-baptized person would contract, from the point of view of the church's economy, a natural bond of marriage that would be perfectly valid. So Canon 1125 provides the norm to answer our question about the conditions. It reads as follows. The local ordinary can grant permission of this kind if there is just and reasonable cause. He is not to grant it unless the following conditions have been fulfilled. 1. The Catholic party is to declare that he or she is prepared to remove dangers of defecting from the faith, and is to make a sincere promise to do all in his or her power so that all offspring are baptized and brought up in the Catholic Church. Second, the other party is to be informed at an appropriate time about the promise which the Catholic party is to make, in such a way that it is certain that he or she is truly aware of the promise and obligation of the Catholic party. And third, both parties are to be instructed about the purposes and essential properties of marriage, which neither of the contracting parties is to exclude. And if they were to exclude them, then the marriage would be invalid based on a defect of matrimonial consent. The local ordinary identified here is the diocesan bishop of the Catholic party, of the place where the Catholic party has his or her domicile or quasi-domicile, the vicar general, or the episcopal vicar. This faculty can be delegated to another cleric by the local ordinary. In danger of death, the parish priest or the one officiating at the marriage can also grant the dispensation or the permission. This is not the case if the undispensed impediment is discovered when everything is prepared for the marriage. It can be a very embarrassing moment when the petition for the dispensation is found in the envelope preparing the marriage and was never sent to the ordinary for his action. That is why it is a good idea to have the cell phone number of someone with the faculty to dispense. The undertakings of the Catholic party are required only of him or her, and not, as formerly, of the non-Catholic party. The reason for this change during the post-conciliar period was the respect of the Second Vatican Council for the religious liberty of the non-Catholic party. As the Ecumenical Directory observes at number 150, it should be recognized that the non-Catholic partner may feel a like obligation to raise the children in another tradition because of his or her own Christian commitment. The same text goes on to make an important suggestion. Those who wish to enter into a mixed marriage should, in the course of the contacts that are made in this connection, be invited and encouraged to discuss the Catholic baptism and education of the children they will have, and, where possible, come to a decision on the question before the marriage. While a positive agreement by the non-Catholic party is not required, still, the Directory continues, in order to judge the existence or otherwise of a just and reasonable cause with regard to the granting of permission or dispensation, the local ordinary will take account, among other things, of an explicit refusal on the part of the non-Catholic party. It is noteworthy, by the way, that in cases of dissolution of marriage in favor of the faith, if the new marriage is to involve a non-Catholic party, baptized or otherwise, that party is required to make the same promises as the Catholic party. The reason is that the dissolution is a grace or favor rather than a right, and can therefore be legitimately subject to more exigent conditions. The undertakings of the Catholic party, however, are not absolute. The Ecumenical Directory explains at number 151, in carrying out the duty of transmitting the Catholic faith to the children, the Catholic parent will do so with respect to the religious freedom and conscience of the other parent, and with due regard for the unity and permanence of the marriage and for the maintenance of communion in the family. If, notwithstanding the Catholic's best efforts, the children are not baptized and brought up in the Catholic Church, then the Catholic parent does not fall subject to the censure of canon law. At the same time, his or her obligation to share the Catholic faith with the children does not cease. It continues to make its demands, which could be met, for example, by playing an active part in contributing to the Christian atmosphere of the home, doing all that is possible by word and example to enable the other members of the family to appreciate the specific values of the Catholic tradition, taking whatever steps are necessary to be well informed about his or her faith, his or her own faith, so as to be able to explain and discuss it with them, praying with the family for the grace of Christian unity as the Lord wills it. So, important principle of ecumenism always is to be well informed about one's own tradition and to be able to explain it to the dialogue partner, even if that dialogue partner is one's own spouse or children. The just and reasonable cause is a relatively low standard in canon law. It can include a strong desire to marry a particular person, the unlikelihood of other choices, or even a strong commitment to ecumenism and the opportunity of promoting its value in a mixed marriage. Indeed, the Ecumenical Directory, discussing pastoral care for mixed marriages, affirms at number 145, these marriages, even if they have their own particular difficulties, contain numerous elements that could well be made good use of and developed, both for their intrinsic value and for the contribution they make to the ecumenical movement. This is particularly true when both parties are faithful to their religious duties. Their common baptism and the dynamism of grace provide the spouses in these marriages with the basis and motivation for expressing unity in the sphere of moral and spiritual values. So Pace Paul VI said there wasn't much hope for promoting ecumenism in mixed marriages, said that in 1970. In 1993, the Ecumenical Directory said something different. On to the third question. What formalities are to be observed in the celebration of marriage? The basic norms for the so-called canonical form of marriage is, the basic norm is contained in Canon 1108, which reads as follows. Only those marriages are valid which are contracted before the local ordinary, pastor, or a priest or deacon delegated by either of them, who assist. And assist is the technical canonical term for officiating at a marriage. They assist, and before two witnesses, according to the rules expressed in the following canons, and without prejudice to the exceptions mentioned in Canon 144, 1112, paragraph 1, 1116, and 1127, paragraphs 1 and 2. The person who assists at a marriage, okay, the officiant, is understood to be only that person who is present, asks for the manifestation of consent of the contracting parties, and receives it in the name of the church. So the three acts, if you will, of the officiant, of the one assisting. The obligation of observing canonical form, a matter of merely ecclesiastical law, was first imposed by the Council of Trent. Its purpose was to exclude the clandestine marriages that were common at the time and were appealed to, either truthfully or otherwise, to uphold a contention that a subsequent marriage which was invalid, by reason of previous bond. The exceptions included in Canon 1108, paragraph 1, include the supplied faculty to assist at marriage in cases of factual or legal common error, or positive and probable doubt of law or of fact. The extraordinary assistance at marriage by a layperson, when the bishop appoints a layperson because of a shortage of clergy to assist at marriages. And finally, the use of the so-called extraordinary form when a qualified minister is unavailable, either in danger of death or for a period prudently foreseen to continue for 1 month. So it's the desert island notion. The final exception is the dispensation from canonical form in marriages between Catholics and non-Catholics, baptized or otherwise. The norm is contained in Canon 1127. The prescripts of Canon 1108 are to be observed for the form to be used in a mixed marriage. Nevertheless, if a Catholic party contracts marriage with a non-Catholic party of an Eastern rite, the canonical form of the celebration must be observed for laicity only. For validity, however, the presence of a sacred minister is required, and the other requirements of law are to be observed. Paragraph 2. If grave difficulties hinder the observance of canonical form, the local ordinary of the Catholic party has the right of dispensing from the form in individual cases, after having consulted with the ordinary of the place in which the marriage is celebrated, and with some public form of celebration for validity. It's for the Conference of Bishops to establish norms by which the aforementioned dispensation is to be granted in a uniform manner. Third paragraph, it is forbidden to have another religious celebration of the same marriage, to give or renew matrimonial consent before or after the canonical celebration, according to the norm of paragraph 1. Likewise, there is not to be a religious celebration in which the Catholic who is assisting and a non-Catholic minister with a non-Catholic minister together, using their own rights, ask for the consent of the parties, so that you would have the non-Catholic minister and the Catholic minister asking for the consent of the Catholic party, the non-Catholic minister asking for the consent of the non-Catholic party. That is forbidden. It doesn't, I should think, vitiate the validity of the marriage, but it is prohibited. The dispensation from canonical form was also first introduced by Paul VI in Matrimonia Mixta in 1970. To be noted is the separate discipline used with respect to the Orthodox. A Catholic party who contracts marriage without observing canonical form does so validly as long as a sacred minister, a priest or deacon, assists, understood here as a Orthodox priest or deacon, except for the fact that the Orthodox don't authorize deacons to assist at marriage. The law here is acknowledging the jurisdiction of the Orthodox minister even when one party is Catholic. Although such marriages are valid, they are illicit. Proper observance of the law would require the Catholic party to seek a dispensation from canonical form, even when marrying an Orthodox Christian before an Orthodox priest. Also noteworthy is the higher standard for giving the dispensation from form. Canon 1127, paragraph 2, calls for grave difficulties, not the just and reasonable cause for the other permission and dispensation. Grave difficulties in the observance of canonical form. Situations envisioned here would include those for which a valid marriage would be unlikely unless the dispensation were given. Other grave difficulties include the cultural and religious sensibilities of the non-Catholic families involved and obtaining parental consent. The Ecumenical Directory at paragraph 154 further includes the particular religious commitment of the non-Catholic party or a family relationship with a non-Catholic clergyman. Other motives could be added to these. Practice in this matter has become somewhat lax in recent years, and mere preference on the part of the couple has been used, which raises questions about the validity of the dispensation. In cases of doubt, however, serious doubt, positive doubt, concerning the sufficiency of the reason, the dispensation is given validly and licitly. I would simply add the pastoral observation that a Catholic party could easily be given the impression that the Church has little interest in celebrating his or her marriage within its liturgical context if the higher standard for dispensing from form is not maintained. So pastors who were to say to a Catholic party, to a mixed marriage, well, we really don't care where you celebrate your marriage. You can celebrate it here if you like, and if you don't, we'll get your dispensation from form and you can celebrate it in the local Protestant church or wherever your intended spouse worships. The Ecumenical Directory at number 157 makes provision for the participation of Catholic ministers at a mixed marriage where a dispensation from form has been given. It reads, with the previous authorization of the local ordinary, and if invited to do so, a Catholic priest or deacon may attend or participate in some way in the celebration of mixed marriages in situations where the dispensation from canonical form has been granted. In these cases, there may be only one ceremony in which the presiding person receives the marriage vows. At the invitation of this celebrant, the Catholic priest or deacon may offer other appropriate prayers, read from the scriptures, give a brief exhortation, and bless the people. Similarly, number 158 of the directory provides for the participation of a non-Catholic minister at a wedding at which a Catholic priest or deacon assists, so where a dispensation from form has not been requested and granted, but takes place in the context of the Catholic Church, and the non-Catholic minister is welcome to participate. It reads, upon request of the couple, the local ordinary may permit the Catholic priest to invite the minister of the party of the other church or ecclesial community. Notice church and ecclesial community. Church generally refers to the Orthodox churches, ecclesial communities generally to the Protestant churches. Can invite one of those ministers to participate in the celebration of the marriage, to read from the scriptures, give a brief exhortation, and bless the couple. Very much a reciprocal kind of arrangement. While the Ecumenical Directory does not deal with interreligious matters, including marriage, analogous application of some of its provisions is possible. But there are special problems attached to marriages between Catholics and Jews or Muslims. Devout Jews are strongly opposed to marriage with non-Jews. But at this time in the United States, some rabbis can be found, particularly in larger urban settings, who are willing to participate in interreligious marriage ceremonies. These can be celebrated either according to the Catholic rite of marriage, already adopted for non-sacramental unions. So if you look at the rite of marriage, you'll see a particular form of that rite that's intended for marriages between Catholics and unbaptized persons. Or with the dispensation from canonical form according to the Jewish marriage ceremony. Whoever the principal officiant, the clergyman of the other party can have a role, as long as the provision of Canon 1127 is observed. That's that prohibition against one clergyman asking for consent of one party and the other of the other party. That there be clarity about who the principal officiant is guarantees an outward manifestation of the unity of marriage itself. So if people say, well, why can't you do that? Why can't you have the rabbi ask him and the priest ask her? It's because that sign would break down the notion of the unity of marriage. As for communicatio in sacris, on the part of the baptized non-Catholic party, to the mixed marriage at the rite of marriage itself, number 159 of the Ecumenical Directory largely restates the discipline of Canon 844, which we'll look at shortly, but seems to open the door to identifying the celebration of a mixed marriage as some other grave necessity that would justify the reception of Holy Communion by a member of an ecclesial community. The paragraph, which is an important one, reads as follows. Because of problems concerning Eucharistic sharing, which may arise from the presence of non-Catholic witnesses and guests, a mixed marriage celebrated according to the Catholic form ordinarily takes place outside the Eucharistic liturgy. For a just cause, however, the diocesan bishop may permit the celebration of the Eucharist. And that is just another, it's one of many little mistakes in the Ecumenical Directory. The diocesan bishop is the bishop alone, and not the other ordinaries, the vicar general and the episcopal vicar. The rite of marriage says that the local ordinary can permit the nuptial mass and doesn't require the permission of the diocesan bishop. And that text trumps this one because that's a pontifical text and this is simply a curial text. In the latter case, the decision as to whether the non-Catholic party, so in the latter case, that is to say when the nuptial mass is allowed at a mixed marriage, the decision as to whether the non-Catholic party of the marriage may be admitted to Eucharistic communion is to be made in keeping with the general norms existing in the matter, both for Eastern Christians and for other Christians, taking into account the particular situation of the reception of the sacrament of Christian marriage by two baptized Christians. A little bit of an awkward expression, but the point that the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity is making in this text is that inasmuch as the two parties to the marriage already share a common baptism, and insofar as they're entering into a second sacrament, the sacrament of marriage, might it not be appropriate for them to receive the Eucharist together on this occasion? Okay. Such participation remains nonetheless exceptional, and the following paragraph, 160 of the Ecumenical Directory, makes this point emphatically. This leads us to the second of the two major areas of legislation that I have proposed to present to you this evening, namely communicatio in sacris, or the sharing of the sacraments. The reference in the Ecumenical Directory that I just cited highlights the distinction between, on the one hand, confusion about hospitality with regard to wedding guests, and on the other, a profound desire for Eucharistic communion on the part of two devout but separated Christians on their wedding day and on the other occasions, other important occasions during their married life. This difficult question ranks very high among the concerns of some official ecumenical dialogues, particularly between Catholics and Anglicans, and those of groups of Christian spouses involved in the living out of mixed marriages, especially the Association of Interchurch Families. Now, this is a very interesting group, a worldwide group that has branches in different countries of the world. I'd encourage you to have a look at their website, Interchurch Families, and to see how strongly committed to the notion of shared Eucharistic communion they are. Canon 844 is the heart of the Latin Church's law on CIS. The norm is situated among the introductory canons of Book 4's treatment of the sacraments. Its first paragraph establishes the general principle that restricts Catholics to receive the sacraments from Catholic ministers and obliges Catholic ministers to give the sacraments only to Catholics. This principle, however, admits of exceptions as contained in the following three paragraphs. The justification for Canon 844's general restriction, as well as for its exceptions, is grounded in a twofold principle of Vatican II's decree on ecumenism, unitatis redintegratio, the significatio unitatis and the gratia procuranda dimensions of the sacraments. The Council Fathers decree as follows: witness to the unity of the Church very generally forbids common worship to Christians, but the grace to be had from it sometimes commends this practice. The text adds a somewhat prescient warning. CIS is not to be considered as a means to be used indiscriminately for the restoration of unity among Christians. In other words, the practice is an exceptional one. More specific judgments in this matter are left by the Council to the local episcopal authority, the Conference of Bishops, or the Holy See. This is the Council's general principle applicable to all separated brethren, whether they're Oriental Christians, Orthodox, or churches of the Reform. With respect to the separated churches of the East, UR 15 surpassed the measured tone of UR 8, which we just read. Because these churches possess true sacraments, apostolic succession, the priesthood, and the Eucharist, some common worship is not only possible, but to be encouraged. While the same text requires the approval of ecclesiastical authority for such CIS, given suitable circumstances, it does not suggest what they are. For that we need to look for another source, and we find it in the decree on the Oriental churches. Here again, of course, the more permissive discipline refers also to the faithful of the separated Oriental churches. While any CIS, the decree warns, which harms the unity of the church or involves formal acceptance of error or the danger of aberration in the faith, of scandal and adiphotism, is forbidden by divine law, it goes on to affirm that absent these dangers, the needs of the salvation of souls and their spiritual good are impelling motives for sharing of the sacraments, and that's in OE paragraph 26. Concern for the same dangers would underlie any judgment with respect to the admission of other than separated Oriental Christians, namely Protestants, though such danger may be presumed to be more proximate in their case, obviously, given the fewer bonds of communion between the two groups of Christians. We find in the second paragraph of Canon 844 the exception for Catholics to receive the sacraments, and in the case of each of the three paragraphs, these are the sacraments of Eucharist, penance, and anointing of the sick, from non-Catholic ministers. They may do so whenever necessity requires it or true spiritual advantage suggests it, and provided that danger of error or indifferentism is avoided, and when it is physically or morally impossible to approach a Catholic minister. The non-Catholic ministers must be those in whose churches these sacraments are valid. Here, the Ecumenical Directory at number 132 introduces complicating new factors to the norm of Canon 844, paragraph 2. It allows a Catholic to receive the sacraments from a minister in whose church these sacraments are valid, or from one who is known to be validly ordained, according to the Catholic teaching on ordination. The circumstances are limited to danger of death and cases for which reciprocal decrees exist for admitting members of ecclesial communities to the sacraments in situations of grave and urgent need, partially applying, in respect to the urgent need, the norm of Canon 844, paragraph 4, to Catholics receiving the sacraments from non-Catholic ministers. The Ecumenical Directory context is the heading, Sharing Sacramental Life with Christians of Other Churches and Ecclesial Communities. The term other churches here would include the Polish National Catholic Church in the United States and Canada, according to the criterion established in Canon 844, paragraph 3, because of their valid orders. But beyond that, this Ecumenical Directory norm has unduly raised the hopes of Anglican clergy who, notwithstanding the traditional Catholic teaching based on Apostolicae Curae of Leo XIII, would contend on some extrinsic basis that an Anglican is validly ordained according to Catholic teaching. Say that there was a validly ordained schismatic bishop who was engaged in the ordination of the bishop who subsequently ordained that priest. Similarly, are Catholic priests who have left the Catholic Church to serve as Anglican or Lutheran ministers to be counted as exceptions to the discipline of Canon 844, paragraph 2. At best, this provision can lead to serious confusion and perhaps scandal. Moreover, one could reasonably question the sacramental intention of a former Catholic priest functioning in a Protestant context. In my opinion, the Ecumenical Directory has exceeded its competence in this matter, and on the basis of Canon 33, paragraph 1, it cannot have derogated from the law of the Code. Elsewhere, however, the Ecumenical Directory properly adds helpful supplementary material to the legislative norms of the Code. Number 124, for example, urges Catholics, rightly it seems to me, with regard to ecumenical sensitivity, to respect the more restrictive practices of Orthodox churches in not admitting other than Orthodox faithful to communion, and therefore to refrain from approaching Orthodox ministers to request the sacraments in a way that would be offensive to Orthodox discipline. The third paragraph of Canon 844 is broadly permissive. It rightly presumes appropriate sacramental faith on the part of Oriental Christians, but requires a spontaneous request, not the response to an invitation on the part of the non-Catholic for admission to the sacraments. Here, too, the Ecumenical Directory fittingly calls for Catholic ministers to be sensitive to the Oriental discipline prohibiting their faithful from receiving the sacraments outside their own church. In any case, notwithstanding the apparently extensive applicability of Canon 844, paragraph 3, the exceptional character of all CIS is still presumed. In view of the restrictive discipline that commonly binds Orthodox clergy and faithful, Catholic ministers are rarely confronted with a pastoral dilemma posed by the norms of paragraphs 2 and 3 of Canon 844. More frequently do they face the catechetical challenge of helping Catholic faithful to understand more clearly why they are not free to accept the invitation extended by non-Catholic ministers to receive from the communion table at an Anglican or Protestant church. In his 2003 encyclical Ecclesia de Eucharistia, John Paul II points out how the communities of the Reform, especially because of the lack of the sacrament of orders, have not preserved the genuine and total reality of the Eucharistic mystery. He concludes, the Catholic faithful, therefore, while respecting the religious convictions of these separated brethren, must refrain from receiving the communion distributed at their celebrations, so as not to condone an ambiguity about the nature of the Eucharist, and consequently to fail in their duty to bear clear witness to the truth. This would result in slowing the progress being made toward full visible unity. The Pope's insistence on an unambiguous discipline, therefore, is based on a commitment to authentic ecumenism. He shows further regard for the separated brethren and their devotion when, citing UR 22, he makes the following affirmation of the ecclesial communities. When they celebrate the Lord's death and resurrection in the Holy Supper, they profess that it signifies life in communion with Christ, and they await his coming in glory. But even to engage in the catechesis described here would be for many Catholic ministers a rather rare experience, except in the case of mixed marriage couples where both parties practice their faith and where the notion of graciously accepting hospitality tends to be a compelling factor in a Catholic party's desire to communicate outside the Catholic Church. A related challenge among Catholic clergy is their faithful observance of the fairly restrictive and somewhat complex discipline of Canon 844, paragraph 4, which regulates admission to the Catholic sacraments of other than Oriental Christians who typically come from communities where baptism alone is the criterion for admission to Holy Communion. So you have this kind of peculiar irony, that Orthodox discipline is very restrictive. Catholic discipline vis-a-vis the Orthodox is very permissive. Protestant discipline is very permissive with respect to communion, but the Catholic discipline is very restrictive with respect to the Protestants. So therein lies the kind of serious pastoral challenge. So Canon 844, paragraph 4 is really where the rubber hits the road on all of this, because for the most part the Orthodox aren't interested in Eucharistic sharing. And also Orthodox mixed marriages tend to be somewhat fewer because of the strong interest in Greeks marrying Greeks. In my understanding of the norm of Canon 844, paragraph 4, there are 4 subjective criteria required of the Protestant desiring to receive the sacraments of Eucharist, penance, and anointing of the sick. And think about the particular Protestant being the Protestant spouse, the Anglican, the Lutheran, particularly spouse from communities where Holy Communion is celebrated, their desire to receive the sacraments in the church of their Catholic spouse and their Catholic children often. 2 of these conditions are identical with those of the previous paragraph governing the Orthodox. First, the spontaneous request and the right disposition. The other 2 are, first, no access to their own minister. It's not clear why this is not a criterion with respect to the Orthodox. And more importantly, Catholic faith in the sacrament in question. While with respect to the Eucharist, this has been widely believed to include an affirmation of the real presence of Christ in the consecrated species, John Paul II, in Ecclesia de Eucharistia, makes it clear that the denial of one or more truths of the faith regarding these sacraments renders the person asking improperly disposed to legitimately receiving them. And he specifically includes the truth regarding the need of the ministerial priesthood for their validity. So if Protestants come from those communities which affirm, even under extraordinary circumstances, the possibility of lay presidency at the Eucharist, then they would be effectively denying the necessary connection between the ordained priesthood and the valid Eucharist. He adds, the Pope adds, that no dispensation can be given from this condition because, one may only presume, it is a matter of divine law. While a general decree might more precisely specify what constitutes Catholic faith in a particular sacrament, these conditions or criteria that I have called subjective are properly verified by the priest or deacon administering the sacrament. Similarly, he could appropriately determine circumstances in which danger of death was present. But the more typical objective situation justifying CIS is that of the other grave necessity in the judgment of the diocesan bishops or the conference of bishops. The duty of deciding on whether or not another grave necessity exists to justify CIS beyond danger of death belongs at least to the diocesan bishop, and therefore not a vicar general or episcopal vicar without a special mandate. The matter is serious enough to require the diocesan bishop's personal attention and decision, unless the Episcopal Conference has already determined circumstances that justify CIS. I interpret this exclusivity, so the one canceling out the other, by the use of the Latin words out, in the text of Canon 844, paragraph 4. It tells us that the authority of the Episcopal Conference, once it's received the recognitio of the Holy See, would bind a diocesan bishop, though that bishop could conceivably determine further circumstances justifying CIS besides those identified by the conference. It should be noted that bishops' conferences have largely refrained from enacting general decrees in this area. Certainly the American bishops have so refrained, perhaps in order not to bind individual bishops by a conference-wide law. Another reason might be a concern that the Holy See once asked for the recognitio, might not judge the necessity as grave as the conference did. In any case, relatively few bishops have issued general decrees as a matter of diocesan law in response to the Ecumenical Directory's suggestion that they do so. Actually, 4 dioceses in Australia have done so, and they're very interesting texts, which we won't have time to look at this evening, but you can find them via the Interchurch Families website and have a look at them. They're somewhat defective technically, but they show, I think, a certain boldness on the part of the hierarchy in Australia to do this, especially of Archbishop John Bathersby of Brisbane, who is the co-chair of the International Anglican Roman Catholic Commission for Unity and Mission. The document, back to the Ecumenical Directory, says at number 130, it's strongly recommended that the diocesan bishop, taking into account any norms which have been established for this matter by the Episcopal Conference, establish general norms for judging situations of grave and pressing need and of verifying the conditions mentioned below. Those are the conditions I have called subjective ones, to be verified by the ministering priest. But there is no reason why particular law could not further direct the discernment in matters such as the manifestation of Catholic faith or the inavailability of the non-Catholic's own minister. The Directory's words about taking into account any norms which may have been established for this matter by the Episcopal Conference mistakenly suggests, in my opinion, that the bishop is free to follow those criteria or not, as he would, for example, with regard to Canon 961, paragraph 2, on general absolution, where the words are simply giving attention to the norms established in this matter by the Episcopal Conference, but still guaranteeing the bishop his right to make that decision on his own, regardless of the conference's norm. Since Episcopal Conferences, whatever their reason, have remained silent on this matter, the judgment in practice falls to the diocesan bishop in deciding what these other grave necessities might be. The first version of the Ecumenical Directory, published in 1967 and 1970, specified people in prison or suffering persecution, along with other cases of urgent necessity. The 3 bishops' conferences of England and Wales, Ireland and Scotland, in their joint 1998 teaching document on the Eucharist, One Bread, One Body, offered the following guideline at number 106. Admission to Holy Communion and to the sacraments of reconciliation and anointing of the sick may be given to baptized Christians of other faith communities if there is a danger of death or if there is some other grave and pressing need. Okay, so following the norm up to there of Canon 844, paragraph 4. This may at times include, the text goes on to read, those who ask to receive them on a unique occasion for joy or sorrow in the life of a family or an individual. It is for the diocesan bishop or his delegate to judge the gravity of the need and the exceptional nature of the situation. The conditions of canon law must always be fulfilled. The exceptional nature and purpose of the permission should be made clear, and appropriate preparation should be made for the reception of the sacrament. In brief, therefore, the document identifies a unique occasion for joy or for sorrow in the life of a family or an individual as another grave necessity required by Canon 844, paragraph 4. The subsequent paragraph of OBOB explains that these norms apply to individual cases and not categories of situations, and that there is no intention to set precedent. It gives in number 109 the following examples of these one-off situations: baptism, confirmation, first communion, marriage, ordination, and death. Before we analyze the content of that document, and its nature, we need to attend to a further provision of the Ecumenical Directory. After its number 130 strongly recommends that bishops establish general norms for judging situations of grave and pressing need, it goes on to give advice about how the ministering priest should proceed in the absence of such diocesan norms. Catholic ministers will judge individual cases and administer these sacraments only in accord with these established norms where they exist. Otherwise, they will judge according to the norms of this directory. But the directory, with the one possible exception of that open door that I mentioned at paragraph 159, has no norms that specify other grave and pressing needs. Here, the Ecumenical Directory is confusing, and it detracts attention from the norm of Canon 844, paragraph 4, which clearly gives competence to the diocesan bishop in making such a judgment. The British and Irish document somewhat awkwardly explains the nature of the general norms on sacramental sharing at its paragraph 95 by repeating almost verbatim the confusing provision of the Ecumenical Directory 130, which we just recited. It goes on to add the following. In order to guide Catholic pastors in our countries, our bishops' conferences now establish norms in this important matter. There are two sets of norms, one concerning Christians from Eastern churches, the other concerning Christians from churches and ecclesial communities of the West. Catholic priests are to discern each individual case only in accord with the norms established by their diocesan bishop, or, in the absence of such diocesan norms, those which the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, Ireland, and Scotland promulgate in this document, each for its own territory. Well, unless I'm mistaken, this document never received the recognitio of the Holy See, and can therefore not be considered a general decree. It seems to recognize the fact that fact when it directs priests to observe diocesan norms. But in the absence of such norms, by what authority can the British and Irish bishops' documents supply them? It's my opinion that that document cannot be considered to be doing anything more than giving the bishops of the three conferences the thoughtful suggestion that a unique occasion for joy or sorrow in the life of a family or an individual could be reasonably considered another grave necessity, if an individual diocesan bishop judged it to be so. I believe that both the Ecumenical Directory and OBOB are misleading in their suggestion that these documents somehow supply the missing judgment of the diocesan bishop required by Canon 844, paragraph 4, when there is no authentic decree on the matter by the bishops' conferences. Both documents seem to overlook the option of the various ways in which the diocesan bishop can make his judgment. The establishment of an a priori policy by way of a general decree has the definite advantage of giving priests in advance an idea of how the bishop is thinking. He can make such policy either absolutely or conditionally, allowing the ministering priest to verify the bishop's conditions, just as he must verify the conditions set down by the code itself. The bishop could also choose to require that individual cases within the framework established by his general decree be submitted to him for confirmation, though such a process could excessively burden both him and his delegate and the clergy involved. Finally, where there is no established policy, the ministering priests would be free to submit individual cases to the bishop's judgment to be made on a case-by-case basis. But in no case could the priest, on his own authority, make the judgment about the existence of another grave necessity beyond danger of death, unless, of course, the bishop had delegated him to do so. Our bishops in the USA, either as individuals or as a conference, could conceivably adopt the criteria suggested by the bishops of the UK and Ireland, or individual bishops could use these criteria as helpful guidelines in their decisions about CIS on a case-by-case basis. It is worthy of note, however, that such groups as the Association of Interchurch Families believe that the other grave necessity exists every time the family attends Mass together. This assertion cannot be easily reconciled with the conciliar principle of the exceptional character of CIS. This line of documentary analysis leads continually to the role of the diocesan bishop or his delegate in judging whether one or other exceptional circumstance constitutes another grave necessity other than the danger of death. Some suggestions have been offered from the former ecumenical directory, from that number 159 of the current ecumenical directory, and from the British-Irish document. Any circumstance must first of all be exceptional so as to safeguard the significance of union principle of unitatis redintegratio. Secondly, any judgment must safeguard against the danger of error or indifferentism. Is the bar to be a higher one for the Protestants, for the churches of the Reform, is to be higher than the genuine spiritual advantage of Canon 844, paragraph 2? I think so. Otherwise, the legislator would have used that standard instead of another grave necessity. I suggest rather that the bishop, in making his judgment, must keep in mind the standard set by John Paul II himself in Ecclesia de Eucharistia, number 46, where he cites his own expression of joy in the encyclical Ut Unum Sint, that in certain particular circumstances, the sacraments of Eucharist, penance, and anointing of the sick could be administered to those who are not in full communion with the Catholic Church, but who greatly desire to receive these sacraments, which is a criterion to be found in Ut Unum Sint. He does not make the distinction between the two classes of non-Catholics, but attributes the same great desire to all. This criterion, subjective as perhaps it is, may be helpful to bishops in identifying objective situations of grave necessity justifying CIS. And I think I'll stop there.